Hi, friends. I want to talk about Vivek Chibber. If you're not familiar with him, he is a Marxist sociologist and the author of this book, The Class Matrix: Social Theory After the Cultural Turn. He's also fairly visible these days because he's the editor of Catalyst, which is the theoretical journal associated with Jacobin magazine. And he does a podcast with him called Confronting Capitalism, where his co-host Melissa Naschek basically interviews him about a different topic every week. And sometimes Jacobin will reprint the interviews. So I've seen a pattern play out a few times now where, maybe like not that many people who are Chibber haters listen to the original episode, but then Jacobin reprints it. And someone in the dedicated cadre of Twitter weirdos who absolutely despise Vivek Chibber will find a screenshot from the reprint where they can present something that's being objectionable in some way. Sometimes because they have like a real and substantial disagreement with it about, and they're harshly denouncing him, but it's like about a real disagreement. And sometimes, frankly, just because they don't like him and they sort of try to interpret everything in the most uncharitable possible way. And then lots of other people who never even, glanced at, much less read the, Jacobin reprint or listened to the original episode will pick up on the screenshots that are spread around by the first group. And then the socialist corner of social media will be on fire for a week with people arguing back and forth about, whether this is a reasonable criticism, whether we should in fact think that Chibber is terrible. The most recent time that this happened was about this reprint in Jacobin, which is called "Colonial Plunder Didn't Create Capitalism," and I certainly want to talk about why the interview blew up the way it did, and more generally, right, why Chibber is such a lightning rod for intra-left controversies in a way that you might not expect from someone who is ultimately, a Marxist sociology professor at NYU who edits a theoretical journal and writes books, rather than any sort of professional purveyor of hot takes. Like, if anything, it's often the other way around. I'll see, the professional hot takes artists on social media get riled up at statements by this, ultimately this academic, right, who's not even on Twitter, which is interesting, I think, in a man bites dog sort of way. But before I get into any of that, I want to take the scenic route, right? We are eventually going to get to the most recent Twitter controversy, but we're going to take our time doing that. And I want to start by just touching more broadly on why I decided to do this episode, and in particular, why I decided to do it as the last GTAA of 2025. Red Draco says, I'm an amateur hot take artist. I do it for the sheer love of the game. Well, respect for that. So I think this blow up about colonialism and early capitalism and how exactly the two were related, I mean, that's ultimately like the substantive issue at stake here, is maybe like, I don't even know, like, is it like the 9th or 10th Chibbergate that's played out on Marx's Twitter? I haven't been keeping count. And this particular controversy might actually finally be dying down now. But I do have a few things to say about that specifically. And then ultimately, in the last part of the episode, I want to use that as a jumping off point for a more general thing, which is going to be why I see value in Chibber's work, and why, rather than just seeing him and interacting with him as like a character who, everybody's talking about in these little Twitter controversies that he's somehow part of all the time, even though the man literally doesn't even have a Twitter account. Instead of seeing him that way, you should actually read his books and engage with him as a thinker. He's worth your time. And I want to make that pitch in the final GTAA episode of the year, in part because the next to last episode, right, the one I did last Friday, was on a book that I did not like at all, Olufemi Taiwo's Elite Capture. And the last Substack that, I just put out yesterday was a response to Benjamin Balthazar's critique of me in his new book, Citizens of the Whole World. And look, there's obviously a place for all that. The late, great novelist Philip Roth used to talk about how he liked boxing with books. And in context, I think that meant like writing novels that were in some sense counterpoints or like implied responses to other people's novels. But out of context, I think about that phrase a lot when it comes to literally just doing stuff like this. Writing critical reviews of books, doing episodes devoted to pushing back against things people said in books that I think got important things wrong, all of that. I obviously think there's a place for all that. It's inevitably going to be, some part of what I do, often a substantial part of what I do. Certainly in intra-left context, like those two examples that I just gave, where I think that the left is sort of going wrong, and I want us to course correct in ways that I think will make us more effective and convincing and just more correct. But definitely not only in that context. I mean, hell, I started out left media on the debunk beat on the Michael Brooks show, and I mean, come on. I once read Glenn Beck's book Arguing with Socialists from cover to cover, so I could co-write a review of it with Nathan Robinson for Current Affairs. And that Beck book makes any of the other books that I've just mentioned look like gems of transcendent brilliance. But I don't just want to do the boxing with books thing. I also want to spend some time on this channel talking about books that I actually liked and learned a lot from, and, that helped me sort of see things in a clearer way. And, I guess just generally books that I want to encourage other people to dig into also. And particularly as we head into, we're going to be off for a little holiday break for 2 weeks. I want to leave you guys with a recommendation for a book that some of you might actually pick up and spend part of that time reading, now that you're about to be deprived of my mellifluous voice for 2 weeks. Thank you so much. Drea says Ben's latest Substack is great. I really appreciate it. There's a Drea nod at the end of the Substack that real heads will be able to recognize. But in any case, so I said that Chibber tends to be a lightning rod for controversy. Why is that? Well, to some extent, I suspect that it's the flip side of one of the things I've always liked about him, which is exactly how clear and just kind of how right to the fucking point he tends to be and how he expresses himself. And part of that's about personality, and part of it's about the intellectual tradition that he comes out of. He doesn't use this phrase to describe his own work because he tends to be a historicist about it, by which I mean he wants to reserve it for the original group that called themselves that. But basically, he comes out of a tradition of what's called Analytical Marxism, which is an attempt to productively cross-fertilize Marxist theory with tools from analytic philosophy and, mainstream sort of social science and economic research as they're practiced, in particular in the English-speaking world, is where analytical Marxism really comes out of, in order to make the claims clearer and the arguments more rigorous, and to cut off some of the more tedious and the more, frankly, bullshitty things that we've unfortunately all come to expect when we hear certain kinds of lefties invoke theory, where, when they say theory, you can just hear the capital T. And one of the most important figures in that tradition was Eric Olin Wright, who's a, analytical Marxist sociologist, who wrote a lot of brilliant things about how to think about class structures and contradictory positions people can have in those class structures. And generally, Wright is a theorist that we probably haven't spent nearly enough time talking about on this channel. Since Wright's friend and colleague G.A. Cohen is has sort of gotten so much of the spotlight here. But Wright definitely deserves to be the subject of more GTA episodes someday. And Wright was Chibber's teacher and academic mentor, and an absolutely massive influence on Chibber's version of Marxist sociology and Marxist class analysis. Anyway, whether he applies the phrase analytical Marxism to himself or not, that's clearly the tradition that Chibber is working on, is working in, right? And I think he has all the characteristic virtues of that tradition. I'm sure those of you who like analytical Marxism a lot less than I do would be only too happy to start rattling off that tradition's characteristic vices and say he has those too. But that's definitely part of what's going on. And he's also just an extraordinarily clear and direct communicator. And I want to give you an example of how all that plays out, right? How you can kind of see it all at work in a case where he's actually criticizing his close ideological allies, not just other leftists, but specifically the kind of other leftists who basically share his sort of particular sensibilities and orientation, and are on the same side as him in a lot of kind of intra-left wars. So the case, the example I want to give you is from another Confronting Capitalism episode that was reprinted as an interview with Chibber in Jacobin, called "The Politics of the PMC." And in it, of course, he's talking about the layer of the population that's often referred to as the professional managerial class, right? PMC. And in the interview, he goes back and talks about a classic essay about the concept by Barbara and John Ehrenreich. And he says what the Ehrenreichs are. Okay, here we go. All right, so he says that what the Ehrenreichs are trying to discuss are the layers that have emerged within the occupational structure that are not workers, but that are employed the way workers are. Nevertheless, whereas workers are exploited, these strata are more in the job of managing the workers and facilitating their exploitation. So they're people who are hired by capital, like workers are, but who serve the interests of capital. That's what they're trying to convey. But then he moves into his concerns about this framework. He says, first of all, is it a class? This definition is bringing together people who are employed as managers on the one hand, in corporations and productive establishments and hotels. Their job is clearly to work for the bosses. And then on the other hand, there are professionals, by whom they actually mean lawyers, surgeons, professors, people who work in the culture industry, and even some sections, perhaps, the media industry. These are the two groups that the Ehrenreichs include in one category, the PMC. And their point is that they can both be included in one group because they're both implicated in exploiting and controlling the working class. Now, is their claim actually true? And he argues that it's not, right? And a key part of his argument is that members of the same profession can be and often are in different classes, certainly in the Marxian definition of class, and probably in almost anybody's definition of class. Like a lawyer, for example, could be a salaried employee, or she can own her own firm. That's an easy case. And there are certainly ways that people who are credentialed professionals who need college degrees to do what they do, and are that sort of socialized to put a lot of stock in college degrees, who tend to be in career paths where you don't relate to it just as, oh, this is my job, I do my job and I go home, but you have some sense that you're advancing along a path. College professors, for example, who can apply for tenure after they've been working for some certain number of years. and built up a good enough record of teaching and research, that people in that broad category, that, those people do tend to see the world in a certain way. They, and I mean all of them, right, regardless of actual structural class position, are very prone. I mean, obviously there are exceptions, and this is much more true of some of these professions than others, but in broad strokes, they're very prone to partaking in a professional culture that gives them a certain way of seeing the world. It lends itself toward a certain kind of politics, a certain kind of technocratic liberalism of the kind that's, very well diagnosed in different ways and from different angles, everywhere from Thomas Frank's book, Listen Liberal, to Catherine Liu's brilliant little tract, Virtue Hoarders, which I actually reread at the beginning of this year, right, when I was thinking about the horrifying dawn of the new Trump administration. And I thought it was a good time for us all to think a little harder about the profound failures of the Democratic Party liberalism that got us here in the first place, which I don't think you can understand separate from that kind of like professionalized layers kind of way of understanding the world. But Chibber goes on to make, I think, the very perceptive point that any effective workers' movement will have to organize quite a few people who do in one way or another fit into the professional half of that professional managerial categorization. That given the changing composition of the working class and the makeup of a lot of jobs right now, we're just not going to have a very effective workers' movement if we don't convince a lot of people who broadly fall into those categories, but whose structural position puts them in the working class, to make common cause with what you could maybe call the traditional working class, to see their interests as being aligned with, organizing in solidarity with the rest of the working class, rather than seeing themselves primarily in this light as credentialed professionals. So Chibber says later in this interview that now that means that any labor movement, any socialist movement that grows in the 21st century is going to have to win over large sections of what we call the professionals, because workers, on all the analyses that have been done today, in the past, I'd say 30 years, manual workers, blue-collar workers, don't comprise more than, say, 40% of the occupational labor force. And even if you bring in skilled workers, we're talking about 60%. So the unskilled and skilled working class is the biggest class in the economy, but it's not the overwhelmingly preponderant class. There's still anywhere from 25 to 30, maybe even more members of the occupational structure, right? Percent, he means, right, of the occupational structure that are non-workers and non-capitalists. And you're going to have to come up with a political program that appeals from them. So even though it may be overdrawn to say they're being proletarianized, right? Some of them are, of course, some of them aren't. He gets into that elsewhere in the interview. It's actually a more complicated picture than people sometimes say. But then other people, right, are also being professionalized at the same time. The capitalist economy is always doing both things. And it's always a question of which one is the dominant tendency at any given moment. And this leads the interviewer, right, Melissa Naschek, to ask, do you think the concept of the PMC is still useful? Is it too misleading? Or should we be refining it and continuing to use it? And his answer to this is maybe my favorite part of the interview, because he's, again, he's so clear to the point, but also, crucially, he shows that he's not going to get drawn just deeper and deeper into the weeds of just proving himself right in Marxist nerd debates. Like, the most important thing is, being right at the expense of everything else that matters. He can maintain a sense of political perspective. So he says, his answer starts out, there are scientific concepts, and then there's what philosophers call folk concepts. When you look at folk concepts, you have to look at what people are trying to convey with them. Now, there might be certain folk concepts that are just crazy, like angels or God or something like that. They explain certain things, but they're literally just fictions. But then there are other folk concepts that are overlapping with the scientific concepts, and they do a good enough job that they're not doing active damage. I think PMC is just such a concept. I love that, by the way, right? I mean, it really, speaks to the analytic philosophy nerd in me that he's framing things that way. Anyway, so he says, I think PMC is such a concept. If you look at the criticisms on the left of the influence of the PMC, the people who they were talking about, the strata that they're talking about, somebody like Catherine Liu, who writes brilliantly on the PMC and the ways in which virtue signaling has overtaken political analysis, we know who she's talking about. And those people actually exist. I wouldn't want to say stop using the concept, because the same way that the Ehrenreichs used it, you know who they're talking about. I think they're analytically flawed in the way that they used it, but what they did with it made a lot of sense. So I wouldn't want to have people fill out a form before they were allowed to use the concept, and I wouldn't want to say that this is as useless as angels or demons or something like that. So no, I would not have strictures against it. What I would say is this, that because of the way in which it obscures real divisions and different sorts of emplacements within the economy, we want to be careful about taking a sweeping negative attitude towards it for two reasons. One is that the professional class strata are in fact in different classes, and some of them are going to be people who you're going to want to organize. Some of them are people who are actually being exploited. Teachers and nurses were a great example of this, I thought. The second reason is that even the non-workers, the middle class elements, there are those within them that can be won over to a social democratic or even a socialist program. And so you're going to want to make sure that whatever program you're designing is one that can hegemonize these groups. I think the key is this. What you cannot have is a left in which what we are now folk calling the PMC sets the terms, in which it has hegemony, because that is the left that we have today. And for my money, that was just absolutely perfectly stated on all points. I mean, I think, as Che Guevara said about the Vietnamese resistance to American imperialism, 2-3 many Vietnams. I think the left needs 2-3 many Catherine Lius. I absolutely think she's a force for good and a good influence on the left. I mean, her critique of that sort of PMC way of looking at the world is exactly on point. But we also, I think, as I don't think she would disagree, but as Chibber emphasizes, we also need to have some perspective. We have to have the sense of perspective that he's talking about when it comes to not writing off the PMC, understanding that some of those people are people we need to organize, but also crucially, right? Let me just read that last paragraph again, since it's so good. You want to make sure that whatever program you're designing is one that can, hegemonize those groups. In other words, bring as many people from them on board as possible, because you're going to need them. I think the key is this. What you cannot have is a left in which what we are now folk calling the PMC sets the terms, in which it has hegemony, because that is the left we have today. Absolutely correct. And of course, that gets to some of why Chibber is such a lightning rod for intra-left controversy. He is someone who does have this very clear and direct way of communicating, who's very blunt and to the point. And as you get in that last paragraph I just read, he's somebody who's very openly just not very happy with the overall state of the American left. I mean, they're obviously, you don't want to be too doom and gloom. New York City DSA just won the chief executive office in the most important city in the capitalist world. That's fantastic, right? But there are a lot of things about the way the left is that makes it hard for us to we're going to have to get past if we're going to capitalize on that victory as effectively as we should be able to. And yeah, Chibber just has various sources of dissatisfaction with the overall current state of the left. I mean, some of that, like if you watch his interview with Josh Citarella on Doomscroll, Chibber talks about how growing up in India, right? He moved to the US as a teenager, but growing up in India, the socialists and communists that he'd be around as a kid were people he really admired. And on the American left, even just in terms of personality type, he gets a lot more aggravated with a lot of people who cluster to the left, which, frankly, I can understand. And he does have this larger structural political diagnosis that you just got in that last paragraph of how a certain kind of PMC sensibility becomes very dominant in a lot of left spaces and why that's a problem. And he's very critical of identity politics, which we'll definitely get back to in a few minutes. And you layer all this on top of the fact that he's, just for better or for worse, not really that interested in being diplomatic when he thinks people are being ridiculous. And I think you get a brew that like really shows you, okay, this is somebody who's going to be a lightning rod for a lot of controversy within the left. So, for example, I always think of this clip from Brianna Joy Gray's podcast, Bad Faith, which she herself released to promote her interview with Chibber. So she clearly thinks that people are going to perceive it very differently than I do. And, maybe she's right. Maybe, most viewers did kind of see the exchange her way instead of my way. But, well, let's watch.
What I'm seeing on the left, what I see so much of is some folks will say, we need to have a general strike. And then all of the big brains.
I need to have wings. You can't just say we need to have
you're doing exactly. I'm glad you said that.
The people who say that are absolute clowns. You know what it takes to have a general strike? Do you know how much?
This is the point.
This is ridiculous. I know people say it, but it should be something people laugh over.
So you're illustrating my point. You're illustrating my point. So one response to that could be, I hear you. This is something that will need to happen. Like you're talking about all this labor growth and stuff that also is not going to happen tomorrow, but you can acknowledge that this is something that would help to make a meaningful change. So instead of saying it's a fantasy to say we need to have a general strike, there's a response that says, yeah, you're right. And it's really hard. Let's talk about what it required to support such a thing. And then we're getting to a place where that feels constructive to me, that says, what are the obstacles to a general strike? What are the obstacles?
No unions. How are you going to have a general strike?
But there are also wildcat strikes, right?
Yeah,
we had the whole 2018. I'm sorry.
They're tiny.
They are tiny. What would it take to make them bigger?
A union.
Might they? But also.
All right. Sorry about that. So that clip we just watched, if you like Chibber as much as I do, you probably enjoy the way he's rolling his eyes at this line of questioning. And if you don't like Chibber, or if you're fundamentally sympathetic to Brianna's perspective, maybe all you really get out of that is that he's being rude. He's being too dismissive. And look, I get it. I'm a Midwesterner, right? I grew up in East Lansing, Michigan. And, I think it shows, right? I mean, by temperament and instinct, my way of engaging in most contexts, certainly intra-left contexts, is a bit less combative than this, even when I'm ultimately saying the same things. Of course, Chibber has decades more of being aggravated by his interaction with a certain kind of leftist than I do. So, I'm definitely operating at an advantage in that regard. But, going back to that boxing with books metaphor from earlier, Chibber is way more of a boxer, right, than somebody like me is. And some people are just going to have a bad reaction to that. I think that's inevitable. To me, though, that clip is just the perfect counterpoint, right? The perfect contrast between someone who's thought seriously about questions of class power and strategy and someone who just hasn't. And I know that Brianna is asking in that clip in a some say way. It's sort of news from nowhere. She's not really taking ownership of saying it, but she's clearly offended when he rolls his eyes at the idea. And honestly, when she's talking about things that some say that she actually disagrees with, she doesn't sound like that, right? When she says some say, she means I say. In fact, she has a history of presenting getting together a general strike as if it were the easiest thing in the world. In December 2020, she wrote an article for Current Affairs on Force the Vote, the idea that the Squad should have demanded in exchange for their votes to re-up Nancy Pelosi as Speaker of the House, that the trade they should have demanded instead of like what they did, which was like committee assignments and stuff, which is much more similar, by the way, to the kind of thing that the House Freedom Caucus later demanded on the other side. But instead of that, the Force the Vote idea was that what they should have demanded was a floor vote on Medicare for all, which I always found confusing, right? Because it would have gone down to defeat with no drama or suspense or surprises about how anyone voted by a margin of about 320 to 115, since everyone already knew all the people who were for it and all the people who were against it, and none of them on either side made any secret of how they felt. So the vote would have revealed zero new information and led to zero new primaries. And as Ryan Grimm points out in his excellent new book, The Squad, which I've been listening to as an audiobook on some of these long drives lately, 320 to 115 isn't exactly the kind of margin that would have given Medicare for all a lot of forward momentum. But, and this is me talking now, not Ryan, but the bigger objection to how big a deal people made about this at the time is that no one but the most hardcore C-SPAN junkies would have even known it was happening. It would have been a non-event. And in that Current Affairs article, Brianna has a response to this. She says, oh, well, if you're worried that people wouldn't pay enough attention, here's a solution. Unions could get involved and combine the floor vote with a general strike, which at the time I wrote an article about the controversy for Jacobin where I pointed out that we have like a 6.2% rate of private sector unionization in this country. We haven't had a citywide general strike in any American city since the 1930s. And we've had exactly zero nationwide general strikes literally ever in American history. And Brianna is saying this in December 2020, right? So that would have given those unions who want to get on board and do a general strike a couple weeks to get together the very first national general strike in American history, with 6.2% of the working class even being in unions in the private sector, and not much more in the public sector. Like not much more even when you factor in the public sector, rather, right? That. It's like, just organize a general strike the next couple of weeks to call more attention to this pointless symbolic floor vote that's actually going to sap momentum away for Medicare for all. That always made about as much sense to me as saying that more people would pay attention to the floor vote if the vote was combined with an intergalactic spaceship landing on the roof of the Capitol. I mean, that it's true, but I just don't think it's a very relevant hypothetical. And this wasn't a one-off thing either. I remember around the same time or a little earlier, I can remember Brianna being on Katie Halper's show and talking to, I think, Sarah Nelson from the Flight Attendants Union and pressing Nelson like, hey, when is it time to do the general strike? All right, let's do the general strike. Which is just, this is the kind of thing that you say when you've just have never spent 5 minutes seriously thinking about this stuff. When it's all just hot takes. And the immediate pivot within like 2 seconds of Vivek saying we're not going to have a general strike because only a small minority of the American working class is even organized into unions. Like 2 seconds after that, she just pivots to wildcat strikes. Like whatever. Okay, you don't like the first thing in my bag of tricks. What else have we got in there? Oh, we've got wildcat strikes in there. Which is, I have to say, even more aggravated to me. Like, for whatever it's worth, right? I could speak to this a little bit, right? I've been involved in trade unionism, albeit in a very PMC way, right? I was on the elected board of the Adjunct Professors Union at Rutgers for a couple of years. So I've been certainly in rooms where, we were talking about, possibly going on strike and what it would take to actually make it happen on our end. And, a couple of years after my time in union leadership, we actually did go on strike and actually won quite a lot of concessions. It was great. And in whatever small way, right, I do have a little bit of a sense of how goddamn hard it is to get people to take the risks that are involved in that kind of escalation, in going out on strike, even within the legal framework set up by American labor law, where it's properly authorized and you have some legal protection against just being fired. Not much, but some. getting people to go on strike when they have none of that protection at all, right? Which is what a wildcat strike is. It's just a vastly harder proposition. It just is. And again, like he says in that clip, there are exceptions, but by and large, wildcat strikes are something that's most likely to happen in a situation where you already have high union density, where lots of pre-existing worker organizing has already laid the groundwork and ratcheted things up to the level that people are more likely to have the confidence to, roll the dice with something that's riskier, like a wildcat strike. But if you're just thinking in terms of, what are the options I can advocate for a quick hot take in left media, then you just don't process things in those terms at all. Like with Force the Vote, people would say, you don't like that plan? What's your plan to win Medicare for all? And then the only real answer was build up the movement, do the sort of slow grinding work of building up pro Medicare for all organizations, raise awareness about it, get, campaign for a lot of the right politicians, get a whole shitload more socialists elected to office and a platform that includes it, build up the kind of grassroots, labor and socialist movements that could back those politicians' play, to overcome the tremendous resistance that capital would inevitably put up against any attempt to nationalize the health insurance industry, which is what Medicare for All is, nationalizing the health insurance industry, right? That would be a very hard-fought class war victory. And it would take a lot to get from where we are now to get into where that could be achieved. It's tedious, right? It involves a lot of, years of slow, patient organizing, getting up early to go to meetings, sitting through tedious meetings, swallowing your social discomfort to knock on doors and talk to your neighbors, even the ones whose opinions make you crazy, to see if you can get them on board. None of that makes for good fodder for podcast hot takes. That's not what people mean when they say, what's your plan? What they mean is, what's your plan that we could yell about on podcasts? And similarly, here, what would it take for general strikes to be on the table? Well, a vastly more organized working class. That's a long, slow process. And God damn it, I wish it wasn't. But it is. It just is, inevitably. That's just the deal, even if it makes for a really boring answer in a podcast. And bringing it up as a solution to the political problems of December 2025 just sort of misses the point. Because by the time we achieved a sufficiently organized and militant working class, that stuff, we achieved a sufficiently organized militant working class such that things like doing a nationwide general strike were really on the table. At that point, we'll be dealing with a transformed political landscape that will have a whole new crop of problems, right? So, okay, the reason I'm talking about this right now is that I hope it gives you some sense of both why I think Chibber is a worthwhile thinker, someone who engages seriously with questions about structural power and class politics and strategy, and also why his way of cutting through the nonsense with clear, direct arguments in the best analytical Marxist tradition, when that gets combined with his, fairly combative personality and his dissatisfaction with the current state of the left, which is certainly not shy of expressing, that makes some leftists just absolutely crazy. That makes them really hate the guy. And that brings us to the most recent controversy about, again, that colonial plunder didn't create capitalism interview that was reprinted in Jacobin. And I want to give a little context for what the issue even is before we get into the controversy, right? Like what's the underlying substantive issue in dispute when, with what Chibber says in this interview and why people got mad at it. And I think to understand that, we need to take a step back and think about the classical Marxist theory of history and different ways that you could disagree with it. So that theory of history, right, the sort of thing that's laid out in Marx's 1859 preface, and is absolutely brilliantly elaborated on by G.A. Cohen in his book, Karl Marx's Theory of History of Defense. That theory has three levels. At the bottom, there are the forces of production, which is basically society's capacity to produce stuff. Like, do you have agriculture with plows driven by animals? Have you upgraded to tractors and electronic equipment? Do you have genetically modified super seeds? Are all the grapes picked by robots? All that stuff. Then there are the relations of production. Do you have lords and serfs, or do you have masters and slaves, or do you have capitalists and proletarians, or do you have workers, collectively controlling their own means of production in a socialist future? What do you have? That's the second level, the relations of production. So forces of production, relations of production. And then finally, up here, you've got the legal and political superstructure. In other words, the institutions that are kind of built up on top of the economic base, and on top, in other words, of a certain set of relations of production, and that sort of grow up on top of them in order to stabilize them and keep them going. And the classical Marxist view is basically that what's going on with the relations is downstream of what's going on with the forces, and what's going on with the superstructure is downstream of what's going on with the relations. So when it comes to the origins of capitalism, that view says that, look, of course, if we zoom in enough, in the immediate sense, the engine of system change is going to be class struggle. But the reason that class struggle sometimes leads to a change of systems, right? Often it doesn't, right? I mean, under feudalism, for example, you have like centuries and centuries of periodic peasant revolts that never went anywhere, right? That there was sort of no capacity for a successor system to get going and supplant feudalism. The reason class struggle only sometimes leads to a change of systems, a change in the production relations, is on some basic level of analysis that the new system does a better job than the old one did of further developing the forces of production. So concretely, capitalism replaces feudalism because of those kinds of dynamics, ultimately. Right? Again, that's the kind of story that Marx gives you in this famous 1859 preface. It's the kind of story that G.A. Cohen elaborates in analytical Marxist fashion in Karl Marx's Theory of History. Then you have something called the Brenner debate, which is basically a debate among Marxist historians about this claim, right, the Brenner thesis, that actually, if you look at the origins of capitalism in England after the Black Death, it didn't really have anything to do with this sort of grandiose, sort of traditional Marxist story. It had to do with these much more local and contingent factors that sort of changed the balance of power between different groups on the ground, right, following that cataclysmic event. And I have a couple of reasons that I'm not entirely on board with Brennerism as a claim about the origin of capitalism. This is something I haven't really written about, except as like a very small part, right? Something I'll kind of note in passing while I'm, frying other fish. And I have to spend a lot more time with the relevant literature if I wanted to try to do something substantive about this. But basically, I have two issues with Brennerism, right? One is semantic. It's a definitional issue, which is that often, and I mean, I'm using these terms very broadly. I mean, Brenner himself has more complicated views in some ways than what's going to come across here. Different people who are broadly in this camp might or might not fit into exactly what I'm saying. But oftentimes, Brennerites seem to define capitalism way too broadly for me, which is how they make sense of this starting point I just described for capitalism that you might think is like hundreds of years before anything that's like really recognizable as capitalism. Like that's how they kind of get away with that starting point, by defining capitalism very broadly. They say things like, okay, Ellen Meiskin-Wood is an important figure on this side of the debate, and she defines capitalism in terms of market dependence, which I think is way too broad. It's true that a certain kind of dependence on markets is an integral part of what capitalism is, right? A certain very specific kind of dependence on markets, right? There are kinds of markets that give you substantially non-capitalist economic relations, like slave markets, right? There are kinds of markets that, that they're just sort of not very relevant to, that might exist in capitalist and non-capitalist societies. But, the kind of market dependence that's integral to capitalism is the dependence of the immediate producers on labor markets, right? They don't own their own means of production, so they have to sell their working hours to people who do. And it is also true, and Marx makes this argument in Capital, that there's this set of capitalist class arrangements in turn, right? This cause and effect. These are two different things. You're saying one of them causes the other. It in turn leads to a broader kind of market dependence, since most production ends up getting oriented around commodities, and people can't make things for themselves anymore, so they have to, like, to get their needs met, they have to take their wages to the consumer market and buy all the product, all that stuff, right? That's all true. But I think terms like capitalism and feudalism are best in terms understood, not in terms of generalities like market dependence, but rather in terms of precisely the kind of class structures, right? Like indeed the, capitalist class structure that Chibber analyzes so brilliantly in this book, The Class Matrix, right? That are, again, about what are the predominant relations of production. So I would say that capitalism means that you're in a society where capitalist class relations are predominant, where those are the main class relations driving the economy. And I know dominant is a bit of a fuzzy term. How widespread do those relations have to be in order to dominate? So if you're going to go with my way of divvying up the terms, you're definitely going to have to accept a fairly fuzzy boundary. I think you are with market dependence too, but maybe especially here, you're going to have to accept a pretty fuzzy boundary for when does feudalism end and capitalism begin, and trying to figure out all the gray areas and transitional phases historically can get complicated. And by the way, if we're ever lucky enough to make it all the way to socialism, I don't doubt that future historians will have exactly the same kind of arguments on the other end about, exactly when did capitalism end and socialism begin? Like, actually, I think Americans were living under socialism by the 2080s. What are you talking about? No, they weren't. Half the population was still working for regular capitalist firms. But you see, the radical socialist government owned massive ownership stakes in a whole lot of those so-called, traditional capitalist firms. And look how widespread the practice of reserving half the board seats for representative of the workers already was by the 2070s. And, you can kind of imagine how that argument would go in the future. Anyway, so that's one issue. Another issue is that I think people who accept the Brenner thesis and people who disagree with it, I at least suspect, are often talking past each other a bit, because the question of why did feudalism end and capitalism start is an ambiguous one. Do we mean how did capitalism get its first foothold in the world, right? How did the system first emerge? Because that's exactly the kind of question where we should expect the local and contingent factors about balance of power in a given country at a given time to, play the starring role, right? Like that's the kind of question where you should expect the kind of story the Brennerites are telling to fit very naturally. But that's one thing we could interpret. Why did capitalism begin to mean? But another thing we could interpret it to mean is how did it like supplant feudalism and other pre-capitalist systems so completely that capitalism became the overwhelmingly globally dominant mode of production? And if you're thinking about that question, it feels a lot more natural to think, the kind of big, broad factors that Marx is talking about in that 1859 preface, or that G.A. Cohen's elaborated in Karl Marx's Theory of History, like that's where it seems more natural to me that those would fit in, right? Because look, if you're asking why did one system replace another, right? Again, as the globally predominant mode of production, then I think that kind of classical Marxist story becomes relevant, right? Like, well, surely the fact that it's so much better at giving, like developing the forces of production gives capitalist countries a competitive edge over non-capitalist countries in various kinds of, international competition and opening, in fact, the ability, the capacity to engage in colonial plunder, for example, right, conquering other countries. It also provides powerful incentives for people with structural power in other systems in other countries to promote a domestic transition to capitalism so they can capture those benefits, right? So I think there are a lot of ways that the sort of enhanced ability to further develop and prod on the forces of production can explain that broader system level change. Not how did the first foothold come about, right? Like by very rough analogy, right? If we think about like Darwinian biology, how did the first foothold come about is a question that's a little bit like, how did a certain mutation happen genetically? Whereas how did this like replace the previous systems as the overwhelmingly dominant mode of production, not just in one country, but around the world? That's more like, okay, why did this particular mutation provide all of these selective advantages, right? So that, you know, the organisms with that mutation were more likely to survive than the ones without it. Okay, so none of that, right, you know, is exactly on point here. All of that is just background. This is like what the debate is about and why I'm not entirely on the same side as Chibber here, because he's definitely, right, a fully paid up Brennerite. And also, of course, in the interview, he's promoting Brennerism less against the kind of story that Gia Cohen tells in Karl Marx's Theory of History, and more against the view that the origins of capitalism came from, you know, were caused by the wealth generated by colonial plunder of the Third World. And the key point Chibber makes about that issue, if you read the interview, which I think most people who got into the controversy, I suspect, did not bother to do, but if you read the interview, the key point that he makes is that the problem with feudalism wasn't that there wasn't plenty of wealth to play with in that system. It wasn't that feudal lords never acquired wealth, or, you know, even vast wealth in some cases. It's that the wealth that was generated there, right, didn't end up getting used in ways that, you know, that led to the kind of thing that you'd see in like the British Empire at its height, for example. You know, the incentives created by feudal economic structures was not for, of course, feudal lords to use that wealth capitalistically, right? To invest it, to generate more wealth that way. But rather, the incentive in that structure, as Chibber says in the interview, was to use that wealth feudalistically, right? By doing things like spending it on armies and engaging in, you know, military aggression against rival aristocrats, again, rather than using it capitalistically to create more wealth. And so what he argues is that the real rupture point wasn't about the infusion of wealth from colonial plunder, right? For a couple of reasons. One is that the Spanish and Portuguese empires did get all kinds of wealth from colonial plunder, you know, from what they were doing in Latin America, all that they did not use capitalistically. They used it feudalistically, and thus they didn't become anything like as wealthy as the Brits did. And Chibber points out that the transition away from feudalism to more sort of predominantly market structures that created the incentive to invest new wealth capitalistically, that's something that really started to get going actually centuries before the Brits started building up this massive overseas empire and, you know, conquering India and, you know, all that stuff. And I basically want to say two things about this particular Chibber controversy, right? One is that a lot of the reaction to it, I think, came from people who are just reading screenshots, right? And so they don't really understand the argument that I just laid out. So they sort of interpreted this, like in some cases, I even saw people interpret this as like Chibber like denying that Britain engaged in colonial plunder of the rest of the world, which would be pretty amazing because, I mean, see above, Chibber grew up in India, right? He's written extensively about colonialism and post-colonial, you know, arrangements and all of that stuff, right? I think he knows about the British Empire's colonial plunder. But, rather his point is that, well, because they were already transitioning into these more market-based structures, that meant that the Brits were in a position to take advantage of the colonial plunder in ways that, the Spanish and the Portuguese, for example, really weren't, which goes to his point that it's not like, oh, there was colonial plunder, therefore capitalism. Rather, there was capitalism, therefore colonial plunder led to great wealth in ways that it wouldn't be if it was going to be used feudalistically. And really, rather than saying that colonialism caused capitalism, we should say that it's the structural transition from a structure where there's an incentive to use wealth feudalistically to a structure where there's an incentive to use it capitalistically, right? I mean, that's the, that's the real point, right? Like, and again, I saw some people who, God, I saw, like, was it Margaret Kimball from the Black Agenda Report tweeting about this in a way that suggested that she thought that, like, Chibber was denying that, colonial plunder existed rather than denying that it created capitalism. Again, Chibber's point is that when England became capitalist, it was this, as Red says in the chat, right? It was this backwater, right? At that point, it right didn't have all the colonial plunder to provide the initial seed wealth, right? Which is true. At least, again, depending on how broadly you define capitalism, there are some issues there. But I mean, it is broadly true that, that the sort of shift into an economy where a lot more market things were going on is something that happened before, they really got their colonial plundering on. So that's one thing. Another thing is that I think that a lot of the terms of the debate, right? Like, and I'm not talking about anything Chibber says. I think Chibber is pretty, it's pretty clear. I mean, I do have a critique of some of the Brennerite stuff, but I think the Chibber's pretty clear. But I think especially a lot of the debate that really gets going when people start getting mad at him about it, I think suffers from not really defining its terms well enough. And so it's a little unclear what the issue is, right? So in other words, I think Chibber is very convincing on the point that the existence of colonial plunder wasn't a sufficient condition for creating capitalism. I think where there's more room for debate is whether it's at least a necessary condition for a sufficiently rapid rise of capitalism to global predominance. I think there's at least more room to argue about that. You obviously have to examine the historical evidence, but I mean, I think that becomes more plausible. There's also a way that a lot of this ended up becoming about Marxology, because Chibber talks a little bit about capital in there, and Chibber sort of plays up the aspect of what Marx says in Capital about the origins of capitalism, where he's talking about changing incentives, but he doesn't really talk about the aspects of capital where Marx says things that are much more congenial to the other side of this debate. And so, of course, a zillion people on Twitter would like post triumphantly screenshots of Marx passages where Marx is like really playing up the colonial plunder that happened under early capitalism. And I actually think it's like, okay, yes, Marx does say all that, and I do think Chibber probably does overstate the case in the interview about the extent to which Marx's only point in that last chunk of Capital is about the change in structural incentives. Because Marx clearly does make a great point about various sorts of violent mechanisms that gave rise to the wealth used by capitalists to get their capital going, in the early phases of the system. Marx's primary emphasis is on the domestic side of the plunder, right? The enclosure of the English peasantry, that both freed up the land so it could be more profitably used as sheep pastures and stuff, and also created this labor force that was desperate enough to go to work for capitalists. But he also does, there's some very like striking and blood curdling passages in that last part of Capital about the colonial plunder. But I think the real question here, that I kind of think that some people on both sides of this are not being clear enough about differentiating is, okay, Marx is clearly saying in some of these passages that it's like very non-coincidental that you're getting all this colonial plunder in early capitalism. But is that the same thing as Marx saying that the existence of colonial plunder is a necessary condition, is like a sufficient condition for capitalism, that once you've got colonial plunder, right, you'll get capitalism, in which case that would be a very strange thing for Marx to say, given those sorts of historical counterexamples that we were talking about earlier. And is Marx even saying that it's a necessary condition for like some capitalist economic activity happening, or even quite a bit of capitalist economic activity happening within a given country? That's one question. But then, like, also, you know, like, look, the capitalism, you know, has always rested on a world market, and, you know, what was available in that world market was to a very great extent generated by colonial plunder, right? So I think you can sort of make a more plausible case, both that as an interpretation of Marx and as like an interpretation of what happened, right? That colonial plunder did create, you know, quite a bit of, was perhaps, again, a necessary condition, at least for capitalism sort of blossoming as much as it did, as quickly as it did. Okay, so all of that's kind of what the debate is about, and, you know, why I'm not entirely satisfied, you know, with either of the sort of main sides that I see in that debate. But the last thing I want to say about this particular Chibber controversy, right, before kind of transitioning to the broader and in some ways more interesting, I think, topics that I really want to get into in the last chunk of the stream. You know, it's the last one of the year. We can go a little long. Is okay. Nothing I really said explains why this was such an intense controversy. Like, nothing I really said explains why so many people got so mad about this article. I mean, other than the people who were just getting mad about it because they were misinterpreting screenshots as if it was Chibber denying the existence of the colonial plunder, rather than denying that the colonial plunder was like enough all on its own to give birth to capitalism, or, you know, arguing that capitalism was already going and that's why they could benefit as much as they did. So I think that if that were the only issue, it's like, yeah, look, that's a debate between Marxist history nerds. Like, it's a relatively, I mean, it's the sort of political salience of that is not very extreme, because, you know, we're arguing about how capitalism came about, and regardless of how it came about, it's here, and, you know, how it came about is not necessarily by itself going to tell us a tremendous amount one way or the other about what we do about it now. And so sort of like, okay, exactly how and why did capitalism come into existence is like an interesting sort of intellectual debate to have, but that's not really the kind of thing that people are usually moved to be furious at each other on Twitter about. So I think really the reason why people got mad about it is one where, like, okay, I just said I'm not entirely on board with some of Chibber's views on the underlying issue, but I mean, here I am 100% on Chibber's side of the underlying issue, because really the reason people are getting mad about it is not so much because, like, so many people are hot and bothered by, like, you know, world systems theory is right, and, you know, Brenner and Ellen Meskin Woods are wrong about the, you know, about the sort of story of early capitalism. It's because symbolically, right, this historical debate is sort of used as a proxy for this larger set of concerns about, you know, how to think about the politics of 2025, right? It's race versus class stuff. That, oh, see, Chibber doesn't care enough about colonialism. The idea that colonialism created capitalism is a very satisfying, you know, I mean, whether or not it's true, and again, I think there might be certain respects, if you're careful enough about how you parse the claim, which it is true, right? But for a lot of people, this claim that, you know, colonialism created capitalism is kind of a satisfying story, because it's a story that goes with, that sort of symbolically links up to what they think about the politics of 2025, that like really like capitalism in a certain sense is actually a secondary thing, that like what really matters is, you know, is racial oppression and colonialism, and, you know, and siding with the third world against the imperial core, and, you know, fuck America, and, you know, all of that stuff, right? I mean, like, I think that's really what's going on here. It's, you know, yeah, I mean, I think that's really what's going on here in this reaction, right? So somebody says in the chat, right, that to be even more reductive maybe than I was being, right, it's a proxy for woke versus unwoke left, right? And that's totally why there was this furious controversy about it. That's why it wasn't just like 10 history grad students tweeting at each other back and forth, but it's why there was like all this uproar about it, because it's like, okay, Chibber, who's this very controversial figure, who's very associated with, you know, Jacobin magazine, which, you know, like there's a whole subset of leftists, especially academic leftists, who don't particularly like Jacobin. And it's like, oh, see, he's, you know, he's not into the sort of like, you know, anti-racist and anti-imperialist sort of framing of left politics enough. He's too into this, like, you know, materialist, universalist, class-based framing, right? I mean, that's really what they're on about, right? And there, again, I'm just entirely on Chibber's side. Like, another comment I remember, you know, that like some people have gotten very mad about Chibber about, is one he made years ago, where he was like, look, I mean, you know, the atrocities that American imperialism and, you know, its proxies, you know, commit around the world are very real and very terrible and disgusting, right? But like, if you really want to do the most effective thing that you can for the victims of that, you know, from within, you know, the imperial core, like the best thing you can possibly do is build up the workers' movement, right? The socialist movement, because the more we can fight to redirect resources domestically, right, the more that's gonna help the victims of American imperialism, right? I mean, because like, if you're gonna try to like build up a winning coalition for ending America's like imperial colossus with hundreds of military bases around the world kind of global presence, like the most sort of politically effective way of doing that is by emphasizing redirecting resources, you know, back home, right? And that's going to be the best strategy. And some people, I think, react to that as like, oh, you're saying we shouldn't emphasize this stuff as much, which feels like a moral failure of solidarity. But I think strategically, that makes all the sense in the world to me. And this sort of gets to something I teased earlier, which is that a big part of the reason that Chibber is so controversial is because he's been a very, very sharp and very harsh critic of identity politics. So, for example, there is a, you know, so there's a paper that came out, oh God, like 3 years ago, I think, by Michael McCarthy and Hikaru Dasan, called The Problem of Class Abstractionism, where they sort of say, oh, you know, they like the kind of the new socialist left that's emerged post Bernie, with like Jacobin magazine and, you know, et cetera, right? I mean, they don't. There's a follow-up paper by William Clare Roberts called Class in Theory, Class in Practice, where he's more explicit about drawing up a lot of those connections. But you know, they don't name as many names, but they're like, oh, there's this way of thinking about left politics that's, you know, very much about sort of emphasizing worker organizing and like universalistic material demands, that is just a flawed way of thinking about left strategy. And they say that it's the reason it's called abstractionism is because they say it's trying to sort of derive these concrete sort of conjunctural political strategy conclusions from these very broad historical, sort of very abstract theoretical way of thinking about the functioning of capitalism. And they think that's a huge mistake. And I actually co-wrote an article with my good friend Michael Seckman, or not an article, a paper, an academic paper with my good friend Michael Seckman that is probably coming out in the next issue of Critical Political Science, where we go through this abstractionism argument and we argue that this is wrong. This doesn't really make sense. That actually if you look at the sort of arguments that are made by people like Vivek Chibber and Adolf Reed, for example, it's not really this very high level deduction from these sort of abstract premises. They actually make really concrete arguments all the time, right? That actually like there are all these sort of very obvious, concrete, pragmatic, strategic reasons to emphasize these universalistic material demands. In fact, in principle, you could give those reasons without referencing Marxist theory at all. Although I think that if you do understand Marxist theory, you'll have a better understanding of why those pragmatic reasons hold. But the pragmatic, concrete, conjunctural arguments are the ones that oftentimes those guys emphasize. We think this whole abstractionism thing is a bit of a straw man. All of that's neither here nor there for now. But what I just want to point out is that in that paper, McCarthy and Dasan, their only example of this is Vivek Chibber. And in particular, they're talking about this book, The Class Matrix. And I think that's a really basic misunderstanding of what the book is about, because I think you can kind of see how they get there, because Chibber is widely and correctly understood as a very sort of combative left critic of identity politics. That's true, right? He's really a very forthright advocate of class first left politics, and also Chibber. Chibber's book, right, The Class Matrix, is all about class analysis. So it's a very natural way to kind of connect the dots, to say, oh, I see. The point of this book must be about, arguing against like identity politics and, arguing for the sort of class first political strategy. And that's not really the main point of the book at all. Right. I mean, there are like a couple of passages that suggest that, right? But that's not the main point. Those aren't really the debates that Chibber is wading into. And by the way, somebody in the chat, said he's Eurocentric, which again I think is very funny given where he's from and given a lot of what he's written about over the years. But also, like, if you're going to say his views about the origin of capitalism are Eurocentric, I think you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. Saying that something is Eurocentric means that because of your bias towards emphasizing Europe, you're like falsely saying that something has like European origins that really doesn't, for example. But in order to establish that charge, you have to start by showing why the story itself isn't true. Just sort of saying it's Eurocentric in a way that suggests that it's wrong because it's Eurocentric doesn't really make sense. That kind of gets things backwards. Anyway, so the sentence that McCarthy and Dasan really like emphasize like crazy, right? The sentence that really seems to that they're really like hang their hat on in their analysis of the class matrix is a sentence where Chibber says that that sort of socialist organizing will take place within grooves firmly set by the class structure, right? Something like that. Might not be firmly, but I remember the grooves, right? So as the grooves, clearly set by the class structure are the ones along which, effective socialist organizing will work. And they say, aha, he's just, making this inference from this very abstract, high-level theoretical point about how class structures work under capitalism to this sort of concrete conjectural analysis when that doesn't really follow. And again, I think they're just missing the point. That's not what the book is about. I do think it's, I think that Chibber does assume that class-based organizing is going to be the most effective. He talks about why in a bunch of other places, really not in the class matrix, right? Again, that's not the subject of the book. But I don't think to think that to think that sort of oppositional organizing against the kind of system we have right now and for a better society is most effective if it's conducted along class lines. I don't think that there's anything about that assumes that the sort of structural grooves that have been set by class structures are the only structural grooves that exist in our society. that there are like various, concrete effects or, social structural effects of, the history of racial oppression, for example, or, all sorts of things, right? All sorts of, cultural practices, prejudices, disparities rooted in, historical legal oppression, et cetera, that you could point to, right? So it's not that these are the only grooves along which something could possibly operate. It's that, in his judgment, right, there are like these straightforward strategic arguments why it's going to be more effective if it happens along those grooves, right? That's the point I think they're missing. But really what I want to end by talking about is what I teased at the very beginning of the episode, which is why I would really recommend this book so strongly, right? Like why I wanted to, to do an episode to end out the year that was about, instead of talking just about books that I didn't like or that, I was pushing back against what they said, since I've been doing a lot of that lately, a book that I would really strongly recommend, which is the one we've just been talking about, The Class Matrix. And I think if you want to understand what Chibber is actually talking about, right? Again, remember, he's a sociologist. And the argument he's making in The Class Matrix is a response to two critiques of sort of traditional Marxist class analysis that have both been influential in academia and academia adjacent parts of the left. And again, this stuff, rather than the sort of class versus identity stuff per se, although it's related, is really what the book is about, right? So the first of the two critiques that he's responding to is the one that inspired a lot of the thinking of like the first generation of the Frankfurt School. At a very rough gloss, those theorists asked why the proletarian revolution forecast by Marx and Engels hadn't happened yet. Right? Given that such a revolution would serve the material interests of the working class, right? These Frankfurt School theorists thought, okay, well, proletarian revolution would serve the interests of the proletariat, but yet the workers of the world have not, in fact, united and cast off their chains yet. So therefore, something other than material interest must be at play here. Right? We have to bring in questions of culture and ideology to explain what went wrong. Right, that's part of what Chibber means by the cultural turn in that title, right? The Class Matrix, social theory after the cultural turn. But he also addresses a more conceptually basic challenge that's posed by some later academic theorists. And these thinkers, because like those like early Frankfurt School people, they still accepted the Marxist economic analysis. They just thought, okay, Marxist economic analysis would predict, working class resistance. It would predict socialist revolution. And we haven't gotten that. We've often gotten, working class non-resistance. In fact, we've often gotten the opposite of socialist revolution. We've got like, fascism, right? Obviously it's a pretty big event in the formation of a lot of these guys' concerns and worldview, right? They had to like flee from Frankfurt, for example, because of fascism. And they wanted to understand what happened there, right? Why weren't workers acting on their material interests? So again, they were yes and in there. Like, yeah, the economic structure is there. The sort of basic Marxist analysis of the economic class structure is right. But to understand why the revolution hasn't happened, we need to supplement that economic analysis with again some kind of explanation from culture, ideology, maybe even bring in like Freudian psychoanalysis, all of those kinds of intellectual resources we now need to bring in to explain this. But then these later thinkers, who Chibber is also pushing back against, went much further than that. And they said, actually, wait a second. Why are we even assuming that we can meaningfully talk about economic structures as if they were something that were separate from culture and ideology, right? Can we even analytically separate economic structures and economic interests from the contingencies of culture and ideology? In fact, aren't interests and structures ultimately constituted by culture and ideology? And Chibber notes early on in the book the considerable irony that this sort of deeper critique of classical Marxism, actually, wait a second, it's not just that the economic structural analysis is insufficient. It's that the idea that we can talk about economic structures as something existing autonomously from culture and ideology is sort of doesn't even make sense, right? So he notes the considerable irony that this deeper critique of classical Marxism became more popular among academic theorists during precisely the historical period when neoliberal globalization was proving that the same economic structures can and will metastasize in remarkably uniform ways across remarkably heterogeneous cultural contexts, right? That, cultural contexts where everybody is an Islamic fundamentalist, or cultural contexts like, San Francisco, cultural contexts, like post-Soviet Russia, cultural contexts where, everybody is a culturally traditional Hindu, whatever. Across all those contexts, the same economic structures can, get their hooks in and expand kind of just as well against any of those backgrounds, right? Which does suggest that they have their own sort of autonomous logic that, they can't, that they're not really captive to contingent facts about culture and ideology in quite the way that these critics would think. But Chibber doesn't rest on that observation, right? Just content to just denounce those thinkers and assert the undiluted glory of classical Marxism. In fact, he writes that it would, quote, be a mistake to resume a theorization of class structure as if the cultural turn never happened. And that, quote, there are many reasons that the cultural turn took hold as fiercely as it did, but one of them surely is that its challenges to structural class theory were real ones. Materialists, Chibber writes, have to provide an answer to the most profound and destabilizing challenge from the cultural turn. Participation in a structure requires the constitution of a specific meaning orientation. How could we attribute explanatory primacy to the structure and not culture? How is materialism even possible if all social action is motivated by meaning and the latter is an effect of culture? To point airily in the direction of global profit shares, declining wage levels, and similar economic patterns is not enough. We need to explain how structural logics are even possible once the ubiquity of culture is admitted. In other words, look, all possible human structures do have a cultural component, right? There are certain kinds, what Chibber is saying, like the sort of deepest challenge that's posed by these theorists, is that there are, in fact, certain kinds of cultural scripts you need to be able to internalize if you're going to be able to participate in any given structure. So, he gives the example of a church, right? You just drop somebody from a totally different cultural context and, who's never heard of a church, and not because they go to a mosque or a synagogue, they've just never heard of anything like that, right? You drop that person into the middle of a church, and they wouldn't be able to participate in a way that didn't get them kicked out, because they wouldn't have any context for what they were doing. They wouldn't sort of know what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to act while you're there. So that's one kind of structure. And of course, the capitalist class structure is another kind of structure. You need to internalize all these scripts about how you behave at work, how you interact with managers, when you're allowed to leave, all this stuff, or else you won't participate at all. So again, it seems like culture is just saturating the whole thing from the beginning. So Chibber's basic move in responding both to this deeper challenge and the older, hey, if socialism would be in the interest of the working class, why are we still living under capitalism? Worry that motivated figures like, Herbert Marcuse to turn towards an investigation of culture and ideology. His basic response to both of those challenges is to make an unaccustomed connection within the classical Marxist picture of class relations. Right? So I think it might be worth backing up and just taking a minute to look at the basic outline of that picture. Right? In modern society, the means of production are owned by a class of private capitalists. Right? In earlier modes of production, the immediate producers, right, like peasants, serfs, slaves, right, were kept subordinate by direct force. Or a runaway slave or a serf who doesn't show up for his corvée duty, would be met by men with swords. Under capitalism, Marx famously argued, a parallel effect was brought about impersonally as a result of the underlying distribution of property. Proletarians showed up to the factories whose, many hellish conditions and petty tyrannies Marx spends a lot of capital writing about, right? The proletarians showed up and signed up for those conditions, not because they were being frog marched there at gunpoint, but because of what Marx called the mute compulsion of economic necessity, right? That, if you don't sell yourself to a capitalist, you don't sign on the dotted line, you don't show up to the work, then you're not going to be able to eat, right? And that's less true, in societies with big welfare states that are themselves the products of capitalism's natural tendencies being curbed by victories in past workers' struggles. But basically, right, in order to make a living, right, to participate, in society, you have to, you have to show up. You have to submit yourself to the class structure, right? That's Marx's point about mute compulsion. And so Marx's starting point is just to take that whole sort of classical Marxist picture on board. If you read, like, William Clare Roberts wrote a very critical review of the class matrix called The Red Pill. Obvious play on the other kind of matrix, not the kind of matrix Chibber is thinking of here. But in his review, Roberts grumbles that Chibber's sort of two-class model of capitalism in the class matrix, all right, you have workers, they own the means of production. These are the incentives they have because of that. You have so the capitalists, right, they own the means of production. These are the incentives they have because of that. These are the workers, they don't own means of production. They have to sell their working hours to capitalists. These are the incentives they have because of that, right? Roberts grumbles that this two-class model is parsimonious to the point of being cartoonish, but grants that it gets the job done, pedagogically speaking. And I think he's really missing the point here, right? Chibber is very aware, right? I mean, I think you got this in the PMC thing I was reading you earlier, that any analysis of fine-grained class positions under capitalism is going to be a lot more complicated than just some people are workers and some people are capitalists. In fact, if you read, he wrote an obituary in Jacobin, a tribute to Eric Olin Wright, right, his academic mentor, when Wright died in 2019, right? So this is 3 years before the class matrix. And Chibber sort of, the thing in Wright's work he really singles out for praise is precisely Wright's comments, Wright's analysis on the complexity of real capitalist class structures and sort of messiness of the different ambiguous and intermediate kinds of class positions that people could have, right? So orthodox Marxists, he notes, had traditionally explained away the problem of how to categorize, middle class layers like shopkeepers or various kinds of salaried professionals in one of two ways. They either insisted that these intermediary layers would eventually disappear as capitalism progressed, and everybody either sunk into the working class or, more rarely rose to become full capitalists, right? So that's one solution. You could just say, okay, well, however we categorize these people right now, the whole issue is going to become moot as capitalism develops and proletarianizes everybody who's not a capitalist. Eventually all these people are going to be easily sorted into one of the other main boxes. Or the other traditional Marxist solution is you say, actually, if you look carefully enough, right, if you sort of zoom in enough on the details of anybody's job, we can already sort them into one or the other of the boxes. That the people you call in the middle class are either just capitalists or just workers. And so in the review, Chibber writes, quote, Eric Olin Wright, rejected both positions. First, it was clear that the middle class wasn't a residual category bound to disappear over time. Capitalism actively created the occupations we identify with that stratum. There would always be shopkeepers, middle-level managers, salaried professionals, etc. Second, even though it's true that many professionals are just highly skilled workers, many are more than that. They have real authority over other workers. Their income is only partly derived from wages. They have genuine control over their own labor. Their power and choices seem qualitatively different from that of a wage laborer. So the middle class is real. The question is, how do we incorporate it into a Marxist framework? Eric's solution seems simple, but it was profound. He defined the middle class as those groups that had elements of both classes in them, capitalists and workers. Shopkeepers share some qualities with capitalists in that they own the means of production, but also with workers, and they had to be active participants in the shop's work. Middle managers have some powers of capitalists, in that they exercise power over workers, but like workers, they have no real control over investment decisions. Hence, Eric famously concluded that the middle class occupied contradictory positions within the class structure. What it meant politically was that this class was objectively pulled in both directions, towards labor and capital. Which way its members, in fact, went could not be predicted. It would depend on how politics and circumstances converged at any given time. All right, so that's the end of the Chibber quote. The point of that quote is just, Chibber absolutely doesn't think that there are sort of only two class positions you could have under capitalism. Because again, in his tribute to Eric Old Wright, he's singling out for special praise Wright's sort of messy and complicated analysis of all these ambiguous and contradictory, locations that different individuals can have within the class structure. But Wright was also very clear in his writings on all this that he wasn't offering this more complicated picture instead of the classical Marxist two-class map. Rather, Wright thought that, as with different kinds of literal maps, right? Political maps, topographical maps, relief maps, whatever, right? Different kinds of class maps were more helpful in illuminating for different purposes. So the two-class map might be more useful for thinking about big picture differences between modes of production and perhaps the mechanics of how they rise and fall over the course of history, whereas the messy relief map of contradictory class locations was more useful for zooming in on the details for certain kinds of questions about social strategy, right? The stuff that Chibber was talking about and what I read from the PMC interview, right? About how important it is to sort of hegemonize these professional groups and sort of, in other words, to try to get, people from those groups on board with the workers' movement. So presumably the reason that Chibber mostly sticks with the two-class map and the class matrix is because he doesn't think he needs a more complicated map for what he's doing in that book. He doesn't think we need to look outside of the basics of the Marxist picture of class relations in order to answer the most important challenges posed intellectually by the cultural turners. So Chibber himself doesn't quite put it this way, right? Although when I have, he's told me that, that's correct. That's an accurate summary of what I think. One way of framing the book's core argument would be that mute compulsion can bear far more explanatory weight than was appreciated by either side of past debates between orthodox Marxists and their culturalist critics. We don't need to, as Chibber put it when I interviewed him about this a few years ago, we don't need to stipulate that the proletariat drank the Kool-Aid of capitalist ideology in order to explain why workers haven't banded together to overturn the system. Instead, we just need to notice that workers being compelled by material, conditions to enter the labor market, right? Being mutely compelled to submit to capitalists, right? Being mutely compelled to continue showing up to work every day and so on, are, by virtue of that very same fact, disincentivized from engaging in collective struggle. Right? And I know that last claim is confusing, so let's just take a second to unpack it. Right? Like the assumption both of those early Marxists who said, okay, because the class interests, the working class are served by socialism, therefore we'll have a socialist revolution any day now, and by people like the early Frankfurt School guys who are like, the proletarian revolution that would be predicted by Marxist economic analysis hasn't happened yet, therefore we need to supplement Marxist economic analysis by this non-economic analysis, by bringing in culture, ideology, psychoanalysis, authoritarian personalities, all that stuff. That, he thinks that both of these sides have a fundamentally wrong premise, which is that the traditional Marxist class analysis, right, the kind of class structure stipulated by Marxist theory, that would predict working class resistance. Yet he thinks actually, if we zoom into the incentives of individual members of the proletariat, individual workers, the very facts emphasized in traditional Marxist class analysis would predict working class non-resistance. The thing that needs to be explained is not why isn't there more resistance, it's how does it ever come together in the first place. So what he's saying is the material interests that workers have by virtue of their position in the class structure are complicated. They obviously benefit from successful class struggle, but there are very real collective action problems. And individual workers stand to lose a tremendous amount from unsuccessful class struggle. Right? The fundamental problem is not that workers need to be like ideologically brainwashed to think their conditions are wonderful to opt out of collective resistance, right? They don't need to be ideologically brainwashed to think their conditions are wonderful to opt out of collective resistance. In fact, trying to ideologically brainwash people to think that their conditions are better than they are is usually not very successful, right? I mean, look at the way that Joe Biden was always trying to convince people that grocery prices are all in their head, or the way that Donald Trump, who's now entered his own Brandon phase, is now doing the same thing. He's giving press conferences, tell people grocery prices are all in their heads, and it's working about as well as it did for Brandon 1.0. So it's not that because of ideological brainwashing, workers think everything's great, right? But they don't need to be brainwashed in order to opt out of collective resistance. They just have to be resigned to those conditions. A little ideology often helps the medicine go down, but that's not the main thing that's going on in this picture, right? The main thing that's going on is that the safer and genuinely smarter, more rational bet for most members of the working class most of the time is not to roll the dice of collective struggle, but to default to individual level strategies for getting by and perhaps in time getting ahead, or maybe helping their children, go to college so they can get ahead, right? The thing to be explained isn't that powerful workers' movements that make deep inroads against capitalist property relations, I mean, never mind overthrowing those relations altogether, right? The stretch goal, right? Aren't around us everywhere, right? That's not what we need to be explained. The thing that needs to be explained is how they can arise at all. And that's where Chibber brings culture and ideology back into the picture, precisely flipping the Frankfurt School script of economic structures being sufficient to explain working class resistance and culture and ideology needing to be brought in to explain working class non-resistance. And it's also worth emphasizing here that Chibber is more than willing to acknowledge that, first, the world contains lots and lots of cultural contingency that is in no way predetermined by facts about the economic base, right, the class structure. And B, he's also more than happy to acknowledge that you cannot participate in a structure of any kind, including a capitalist class structure, if you haven't internalized the right kinds of scripts, right? So he gives these two contrasting examples, right? One we already went over is the example of a church, right? That's one kind of structure. And then the other is an example of like a capitalist workplace, right? The kind of cultural scripts that you have to absorb to participate in that structure. And in that review that I mentioned earlier, William Clare Roberts repeatedly says that Chibber only acknowledges one structure, which is the class structure, and says everything else is cultural, whereas the matrix of class relationships alone is structural. But as we've just seen, that's not so. Chibber sees a world of structures and acknowledges that many of them are indeed highly culturally variable and contingent, right? There are all kinds of structures that, again, are whether or not they exist in any given society depends on all kinds of cultural and historical contingencies. So he's not denying that. Nor, when it comes to the class structure, does Chibber ever say, as Robert says he does, that the structure is free of culturally contingent mediations. Rather, he says that the class structure doesn't rely on the contingencies of those mediations in order to plant deep roots and perpetuate himself. So the sort of key move that Chibber makes in this book to carve out space for renewed materialism, for doing materialism without denying the sort of legitimate concerns that led to the cultural turn, but rather incorporating those concerns, bringing them on board, right? So the key move that he makes is, once the ubiquity of culture is admitted, right? His key move is once again positing that the necessary explanatory tool was there in Marx all along. And once again, that necessary explanatory tool was mute compulsion, right? So in other words, there are two issues, right, that we're trying to figure out here. One of them is the Frankfurt School issue. Why isn't there more working class resistance? And then the other one is the sort of issue that like certain kinds of, I don't know, academic anthropologists and so on would make, which is, wait a second, how is it that you're talking as if there are two things, economics and culture, and, like as if the economic domain were some domain separate from culture that has its sort of own, that has its own autonomous, development and whatever, rather than being enslaved to cultural contingency, because it's all culture, right? I mean, anything that humans do together is culture. Like an economic structure, no less than any other culture, any other structure. You have to, you have to be, culturally conditioned in certain ways to even participate in it at all. Right? And again, for both of those challenges, Chibber's response is exactly the same. Chibber's response in both cases is to say, again, the answer was already there in Marx all along, which is mute compulsion. So when it comes to why isn't there more working class resistance, again, the very fact that workers need jobs in order to survive explains why most of the time rolling the dice on the hope of successful class struggle is actually not the most sort of rational move in the sort of immediate self-interest of any given worker, right? Because it's too big a risk for too little probability of payout. So actually, the structural analysis should predict that we'd mostly get non-resistance. And then when it comes to thinking about the issue of, wait a second, how can we even talk about like class analysis, like material analysis of economic structures, as if it were something that existed autonomously from cultural contingencies? So I wrote something about this at the beginning of the year where the analogy that I used was this. We can think of a given social structure like a board game, right? There are different kinds of board games that the same way that like a family could sit around playing a board game. They've got a closet full of board games and boxes. And so it's like, oh, what are we going to play for game night tonight? Right. And they take out a particular game and they start playing. Okay. Well, we can think of like different kinds of non-economic structures. And by non-economic, I don't mean like they're never entangled with economics in any way, or they don't have any implications for economics, or economics doesn't have any implications for them. I just, I don't mean any of that when I say non-economic. I just mean things other than sort of core economic structures, right? Things that are more culturally variable than that. So we can think about like, certain systems of gender roles, right? That kind of structure as different board games sitting in the closet that societies can choose between, right? Like that's our analogy here for cultural contingency, is a society choosing to get a certain game out of the closet and play it. And if you look around the world and say, oh, which gender roles game is a given society playing, we see tremendous global variation. I mean, some like reactionaries and fascists will complain that there isn't enough global variation for their liking. That's the globo homo thing, right? That it's like, oh, see, these liberal standards are being imposed on us. But, really, there's a tremendous amount of variation, right? I mean, if you look at the range going from like Saudi Arabia on the one hand to San Francisco to Sweden, right? To Iran, to traditionalist Hindu villages, whatever. There's a tremendous amount of variation in which kinds of gender role games different societies are playing. And of course, when I say it's culturally variable and culturally contingent, I don't mean that the only thing that causes somebody to play is that they've been like culturally indoctrinated into doing it. Oftentimes there's direct force, right? In various kinds of societies. I mean, Saudi Arabia, you're not playing according to the rules of the accepted gender roles game and the morality police will come to see you, and it'll be a bad time for everybody. And sometimes even mute compulsion ends up getting hooked in, right? Like, so you think, for example, about like transphobic discrimination, right? If you live in a society where, if you're natally male, but you wear female clothing and ask to be referred to by female pronouns, etc., you're going to be like, you're not going to be employable, right? Like the the sort of prevailing cultural standards, or perhaps even laws, are such that you're going to be discriminated against for being trans. That's a case where mute compulsion has been hooked up to this culturally contingent practice, right? But that's a little bit of a different thing, right? And if you go back to, like, if you even think about it, right, going back to our board game analogy, there are different societies around the world that, are still very much playing the transphobic discrimination game, that have, to one extent or another, put that game back on the shelf, that are, in various stages of the process of starting to put it back on the shelf, that have, like the, mute compulsion of capitalist economic relations has been firmly disconnected from that kind of discrimination by passing anti-discrimination laws, for example. So we can sort of think of it as like, okay, if the thing that's distinctive about capitalist economic structures is the mute compulsion, like, if we think of this as like, the engine in the car of the capitalist economic structure, sure, you can hook up a trailer to the back of the car and drag it around, right? So that would be the case where, again, like, transphobia in that example was being hooked up to the car of the capitalist economic structure, but you can just unhook the trailer whenever. That's very culturally contingent. And so thinking about our board game analogy, apologies in advance for how goofy this is, but I think this really is a very helpful way of understanding Chibber's core point. It's a much sillier way of putting it than he would. But look, if we think of all these other structures, right, religious structures, gender role structures, whatever, as kinds of board games that, sure, people might be coerced into playing it, if you don't participate in family game night, you go to your room and, you're no dinner for you. That we think of these as different kinds of board games that a society can contingently happen to decide to get out and play or put back or whatever. Hey, the capitalist class structure is like Jumanji. It demands to be played, right? You can't just choose to put it away, right? In other words, Chibber's point about how mute compulsion can answer this deeper objection to Marxist class analysis, Marxist analysis of, like materialist analysis of economic structures, classic structures, is something that has an existence that's autonomous from culture. Despite the fact that culture is ubiquitous and the structures themselves have a cultural element, it's like, look, again, it's Jumanji. It demands to be played. Like, yes, there are certain cultural scripts that you have to absorb in order to participate in a capitalist class structure, right? To be a worker, for example, that you have to understand, how you're supposed to act at work and how you're supposed to interact with other workers and customers and managers and, all that stuff, right? But mute compulsion is really good at getting people to learn those scripts. And it's such a powerful incentive to get people to learn those scripts that, the bits and pieces of culture that you need in order to participate in the capitalist class structure are ones that people are going to be powerfully incentivized to absorb, regardless of what's going on with their larger culture, regardless of all of the contingent variation that you get between other aspects of their culture, right? It's still, like, regardless of whether you live in an Islamic fundamentalist society or a, hedonistic ultra liberal one or anything in between, you're still going to have, like, regardless of those variations in culture, you're still going to have the incentive to absorb these bits and pieces of culture, right? That's his point. And so the other half of what he's saying, and the more sort of politically salient aspect of what he's saying in this book, is, okay, we've got in the ways he thinks that mute compulsion, right, this concept that was always part of Marxism, can do more explanatory work or a different kind of explanatory work than some Marxists have understood, right? That it can answer these challenges from, the Frankfurt School theorists, from, people who think that like there is just no such thing as an economic structure that's like autonomous from culture in the first place. But then there's the question of what all this means for socialist strategy going forward, because, the first half kind of sounds like counsel of defeat. And look, there is a certain sense in which this is very bad news, because if he's right that once we zoom in to think about individual incentives, there's, the sort of basic facts of capitalist class structure as analyzed by Marxists should actually predict that we'll mostly see working class non-resistance rather than working class resistance. I mean, one way of thinking about that is, capitalist class structures are like Jumanji, but class consciousness, right? What Marxists call class formation. In other words, the working class going from being a class in itself, a class in the sense of just a group of people who all share the same location in a class structure, to being a class for itself, right? In other words, a sort of activated workers' movement fighting for something better. Class formation is unfortunately not Jumanji, right? Class formation is not inevitable, right? This is not a game that, demands to be played. This is a game that unfortunately it's very easy to choose not to play. It's all too easy to choose not to play. But that doesn't mean that he's a defeatist, right? It just means that, again, he precisely flips the Frankfurt School script. It's not that an analysis of the material structures and the interests that people have due to their position in the class structure predicts working class resistance. So we need to bring in culture and ideology to explain working class non-resistance. It's that, the material interests that individual members of the working class have predict non-resistance. And you need to bring in culture and ideology to explain resistance. In other words, the whole challenge of class consciousness, class militancy, class formation is the work that organizers do, the agonizingly slow and contingent work, right, that 1,000 things can usually go wrong with, that organizers do of building up a solidaristic culture, right, of convincing workers to throw in their lot with other workers. And again, a lot of that is cultural work. It's ideological work. It's sort of, you take this, most people, most of the time are not mostly going to be ideologically motivated. That's just not a realistic assessment of what humans are like, right? Most people are not hyper-political. So, but the kind of people who become organizers are the outliers, right? They're the like ideological fanatics, right? The kind of people who are willing to maybe they like went to a fancy school or something, but they're willing to drop everything to get a job as a salt in an Amazon warehouse to try to organize it. So they spend all day doing this grueling job and then spend hours, trying to, to like go around and visit coworkers and all that to do organizing. And again, this slow, laborious work that those organizers do and sort of building up solidaristic culture and, encouraging workers to act in solidarity with each other is just absolutely essential if you're going to overcome the built-in incentive for working class non-resistance. Now, again, since most people aren't super ideological, this only goes so far. But you have to put some actual points on the board with actual concrete victories to start to change the matrix of individual incentives and disincentives in the direction of people thinking, oh yeah, if I stick with the union, if I vote for the socialists, if I if I stick with this movement, that's actually going to lead to my life becoming materially better, right? I mean, that's the hard part. But once you've got that, ideally, right, if everything goes just right, right, you get this virtuous cycle where, you know, the hard work of the organizers does enough to build up solidaristic culture that, you know, that you get enough people sticking with it, that you can like win some concrete victories, put some points on the board. That starts to change the individual calculations. And so enough people are willing to sort of stick with the movement to, you know, that you can build it up from there, and you can win bigger victories and, you know, all that stuff, right? I mean, that's the, you know, that's the way, you know, that's the way that's supposed to, like, if everything goes just right, that's how it goes. Now, there is absolutely no goddamn guarantee whatsoever that everything is going to go just right. Again, class formation is sadly not Jumanji, right? It's a very difficult process. It's extremely contingent, right? There are all sorts of ways that you can start to win and then get thrown back in your ass and start to lose again. This is not a game that impatient people should play, right? Which is really, in some ways, you know, my biggest frustration with a lot of the hot take economy that's taken over so much of left media. That, you know, it trains people to sort of think about politics primarily in terms of having these very quick emotional reactions. You know, you want to give people a sense that everything's an emergency all the time because that keeps, you know, eyeballs glued to screens, right? That you know, that keeps people revved up, that directs attention to whatever you're saying. And these are just exactly not the kind of qualities you want to cultivate if you're trying to inculcate the kind of cadres that could engage in long-term socialist organizing, that could engage in this immense long-term task that's ahead of us if we're serious about building socialism in the United States of America, right? Which is, you know, like the most anti-socialist country in the developed world, right? So if you want to think seriously about how all this works, right, and sort of the theoretical picture that can help you make sense of some of these points, again, the book is The Class Matrix, Social Theory After the Cultural Turn by Vivek Chibber. And I really wanted to end out 2025 on a positive note by telling you about a book that I really liked a lot and would encourage people to read, rather than just always, you know, always doing like critical content, pushing back at books that I don't like. So I am going to finish out on that strong recommendation. And with that, we are out for 2025. We're going to be gone for exactly 2 weeks for a little holiday break, but I will see you back here at the usual time. I know we started a little late today, but the usual time, which is 11:30 a.m. on the East Coast, 8:30 a.m. here on the West Coast, on the first Monday of January for the first GTAA episode of 2026. I will see you guys then. Left is best.